So let me first introduce our panel. So it's always good to know what perspective they're coming from. And, oh, you know what? That piece of paper I had with all their personal details to introduce them, I seem to have left that in the bar last night. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves first. Richard?
Good morning, everyone. Richard Dutton. I'm the co-founder and managing director of a company called Elias Partnership. Elias stands for Expert Legal Independent Advisory Service. And our business has advised companies. I co-founded it with a guy called Dean Armstrong. He's King's Counsel. And he's one of the world's leading authorities on data, cyber, blockchain, and crypto law. So I feel like the sort of permanent apprentice in terms of learning from somebody. So we're not a law firm, but we are approved by the Bar Standards Board, which is the governing body of barristers in the UK. So we've spent the last 6 years advising companies on everything from international data transfers to facial recognition, and technology, so specialist areas, but that's briefly what we do.
Right.
Thank you. So I was here yesterday. I've been volunteered to step in. So I'm not Brandon. I'm Pavel, and I've been asked to talk my kind of perspectives from what I've done at Shell.
And I'm Ian Pringle from the Loyalty Podcast, also a consultant with New World Loyalty. I guess what I've spent a lot of my time in the last few years is arguing with lawyers about GDPR. Because I guess what we've been trying to do is push the boundaries and get companies to look at the really positive aspects of GDPR and what they can do and the funky stuff they can do. But because the law is slightly ambiguous in certain areas, I spend a lot of time with lawyers discussing what they're prepared to do and how much risk they're prepared to take before they commit to doing some funky stuff.
Well, that's good. And Ian, let me start with you, because Ian, you were at IAG, which is the parent company of British Airways, when that data breach occurred. Can you tell us what's it like when you're in the company and you know the data regulator is coming?
Yeah, I think it's a publicly traded company, so I can't say anything that is not in the public domain because internally they didn't know. They shared everything that was shared internally was shared publicly. So it wasn't really a data breach as in that that BA's data was hacked. It was more that the website was hacked externally by some code that was on the booking engine. And then that was where it was harvested. The data was harvested before it got to BA, as far as I understand, so please don't quote me on that. But it wasn't the systems that were hacked. It was the gateway into the data that was hacked. Does that make sense? Yeah. So, and that's not an excuse, and they paid a fine, but it did mean that development airlines go slowly anyway, but development airlines after that goes glacially slowly.
Yeah. But it could have a big brand impact. I mean, people still talk about data breaches that happened 10 years ago. Companies get associated, and it's hard to not be tarnished. Yeah. Pavel, you were at Shell, so you were running a global loyalty program. So you had all kind of countries and regulators and stuff, and you were there right just as GDPR was approaching in 2018. What was that like? What were the preparations like? What were the discussions like there?
Well, I think it was like everyone. I think everyone took a longer time to do training and understand the regulations. But understanding the regulations and then understanding, I think a lot of time and effort's been spent on the threat, like you started it today, of what can go wrong. And I just think a lot less effort has been spent on the opportunity of GDPR.
Okay, cool. Pavel?
Yeah, I mean, it's a global company, right? So I was looking after 23 direct schemes, 15 additional schemes where we were just kind of advising and giving guidance, and it was fun time. What can I say? The benefit of having that big corporation is that GDPR was obviously much bigger than just loyalty, right? You look at HR, you look on what happens on the B2B side, right? So there's the big machine kind of kicked in that kind of helped to provide that process. I think, fortunately, luckily, whatever you name it, that the customer-facing side consent, right? For example, that was already in place, right? So it was just a matter of unchecking or checking the right box. Where the corporate processes helps is to put the governance in place to kind of tick all the boxes of GDPR. The governance, and I thought one of the big positives was that it actually forced us to map out the entire process and the IT landscape, right? In the corporation, and you've got quite a lot of autonomy in the local market. So there's sometimes tech that was local or regional, and this kind of helped us to kind of map everything so that we know what actually happens with the data in those different markets.
Okay. And Richard, so it felt, at least from my perspective, maybe not from yours because you deal with it on a daily basis, but it feels like the regulators have been asleep a little bit since COVID. Are they waking up now? And if so, should we be worried?
Yeah, there was definitely a fall off in regulator activity, but since COVID and since the lifting of the lockdowns, one of the critical things to look at, the critical lens to look at data is this battle that's going on between impunity on the one hand and accountability on the other. Impunity are people like the big tech companies who basically see a fine as a parking ticket. It's inconvenient. They treat it as a cost of doing business. And then you have accountability, which is where the EU in particular, the European Data Protection Board, is looking to make organizations accountable to the GDPR, and particularly if you're looking at some of the future data acts that are coming. There's about 5 of them coming through the European Union. But the people, I think, who should be worried, or things that should worry us, are things like Google Analytics being outlawed in at least 3 countries, France, Austria, and Italy. People who have used the IAB Europe's transparency consent framework, which has been ruled as being unlawful. To my knowledge, there's at least 700 organizations that are potentially directly impacted by that. So I think the message is the regulators are, they've started their engines, and I think that at least 2 of them are being sued, I know by the Irish Council of Civil Liberties, for not performing their duties and regulating properly. So expect to see more of the regulator, but equally, because the regulator hasn't acted, what has happened is the lawyers have. So the class action barbarians are at the gates of many organizations who have not got to grips with GDPR. It was very interesting to see the hands go up as to those people who feel that it's not as scary as it was. Because if it's not the regulator, the lawyers are coming. And we've seen a lot of big uptick in class actions across Europe, and particularly in the UK as well. So.
Okay. Well, that's got everybody excited. Okay, but do you remember, though, everybody, when GDPR was coming, it was like your parents telling you, you've got to do this, but it's for your own good. GDPR was promised, one, it was, there was some threats, right? If you weren't careful with data, right, you're going to be found out and be fined. But also, there were supposed to be some opportunities, too. There was this whole realm of opportunities that were going to open with GDPR. But I bet everybody would kind of struggle to talk about what those are. Ian, because you're on podcast and you've probably got your hand on the pulse of loyalty more than everything, what opportunities are you seeing with GDPR?
Well, I mean, I was really excited by, when the GDPR came out, as you said, they were saying there's threat and opportunity. One of them was data portability. How many people have heard of data portability here? A few hands. So how many hands up here who is a member of a loyalty program, any loyalty program? Almost everyone. Everyone in this room should be. And how many of those people, do you think how many of those are really loyalty programs where they're rewarding you for the loyalty to that brand because they're tracking spend across multiple brands? So it's ridiculous where if we both of us were flying to New York tomorrow, I book a flight every week to New York on British Airways, and you're going to see your dying granny once, If we both flew on Virgin Atlantic tomorrow, we both get the same deal. Although I've got thousands and millions of points and Pavel has got none, we get the same deal because they don't know what our history is with other people. What data portability came in was saying, if I give permission to a brand to get my data, I can have it. And just as an experiment here, how many people here are from the UK? One. A good dozen of you, great. And how many people are members of the Tesco Club Card? Great. James, good you've put your hand up. Because James, you work for Nectar, yeah? And Sainsbury's. Is your email address got Sainsbury's in it? One of them. Perfect, perfect. So if you go onto Tesco's website today, with 4 or 5 clicks, you can get all of your data that all of your transactions for the last 4 years at Tesco, I'll bet will be in James's Sainsbury's inbox by the time we finish this discussion. How many knew about this? You did. James, good. I hope you've done it before. So, and this is the thing. So under the GDPR, you can access data from anyone who holds your personal data and pass it to another company with your permission. And then we can create the idea was to create truly loyalty programs, not programs that reward you just for your spend in one brand. But I can't think of a single organization that actually does it, mainly because Tesco's are very good. They send you a JSON file, happy days, right? If you can take your nodding head, happy days, a JSON file. But lots of people send you a PDF. The law is they send you it as machine readable within 1 month, which is tough, right? And that's because the regulators backed off the really funky stuff right at the end. And it's difficult because, as you said, it was a great opportunity, and yet not many people are actually doing it or building these things because they didn't, as they were politicians, they didn't want to make it, they knew the cookies thing was going to be difficult, but they didn't want to make it even more difficult. Yeah. So, yeah, which is a shame because it could do some cool stuff.
It's good. I can't remember, maybe somebody here knows, there's a company, Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the internet, started another company where we were supposed to have this idea of a data cube, that it was your data, that you could actually then monetize it, and you could share that with a brand. If you're looking for a car, you could share that with known car brands and then somehow pull it back, and all that data went back. And somehow you could bounce this ball of data back and forth. But it's that type of thing, because everybody says data is a currency, since Clive Humby said that, data is the new oil, whatever. But, what is the currency that I'm getting, right? I mean, I'm getting some club card points, I'm trading for that. I guess I'm trading my data for access to free Gmail and WhatsApp and everything like that, right?
Yeah, the closest I've seen to that is athletes. If you've got a coach and you're with a coach and the coach is holding all this data on you. Imagine if you're an Olympic athlete and you're holding all this data on times and blood, all this really, the data portability allows you to take that from one coach, all the data to another coach. I've seen that. You can hold this in a place. You're nodding head.
Well, I mean, it just so happens that we've done a lot of work on sports data over the last 3 years, and that's one of the big problems for athletes is accessing their data. So while the coaches have it, it's the athletes that struggle to get access to their data, and that's why there is quite a lot of litigation going on in the UK at the moment around this, particularly because the sports data companies are essentially using athlete data to sell indiscriminately to other organizations, particularly the gaming companies and the betting companies. So there's a lot of activity around trying to get athletes, that you refer to the cube, but it's their digital vault, essentially, where they can take it with them. And because it does impact on transfer negotiations, on salaries and everything else. So the sports world is, and particularly around sports loyalty, I think where the athletes, there is a view that traditional rights holders in sport have always been the leagues, or the clubs, the venue owners, but it's because they're the ones, if you play rugby, you go to Twickenham, they own the rights, English rugby. But actually, what's going to happen is the athletes are the new rights holders, and we'll see a fundamental shift in that. And I think the data rights that are afforded by the GDPR will allow that to happen.
Yeah. Right. I think that's a great example of that case being a customer-centric use case, right? This is where the athlete, as the end customer, has got a vested interest on what happens with the data, right? But if I get my data on my shopping habits at Tesco, I think that I struggle to see what's the use case for me to share it with PetSmart, right? As an end customer, right? And I think this is where we as
what I'm saying is,
this
if Sainsbury's wanted to give a proposition that said we're going to give you double points if you shop all of your shop with us and none with Tesco, then that would be...
So again, that's a Sainsbury's proposition, right?
Yeah.
So, right? So I think that the challenge is for us, if we want to take that as an opportunity, is to create that use case for the customer to actually share the data. I think that's where, I think in everything that's happened, that probably has not been the top priority.
Because I think that hits the nail on the head about what's happened to GDPR is that if you ask my wife, do you share data with anyone? She says, no, I don't share data with anyone. And yet, you look at all the apps she's using, and it's really, we're signing, we're all agreeing to the greatest lie ever told. I've read the terms and conditions, and
You can't find me on WhatsApp, in case anybody was trying to. You can't find me on WhatsApp because I've got my own personal protest now against anything Facebook, right? It's not affecting their stock at all, but it's this thing, I think, when you're in the industry. So if you think about the trust, and this is for everybody, right? So they just in the paper before I left, in the UK, Boots, the largest health and beauty retailer, was just talking about, we want to share data with the National Health Service, and we think there should be an interactive and make it life easier so you can get your prescriptions quicker, and the pharmacist who's kind of taking some of the stress off the GP practices can look at your medical data if you opt into it and help and advise your family. Would you trust a brand with that? Wouldn't you think, is that going to be used for good? Is that going to be used for evil, right? They could say, he's not healthy. Is it going to be sold to my health insurance company that's going to know that, I don't eat right or I don't smoke, but if I smoked or something like that. Do you guys trust brands more or less or the same, I think, in the jobs that you have?
We've done a lot of research into this, and I think especially with younger customers, it all depends on the utility you're offering and what the proposition is. Because if they want the proposition, they don't care about the data transfer. Whereas if you ask them about data transfer, they really care. But actually, if you say, do you want this service? Do you want Google Maps? Yes. Do you mind that Google Maps tracks you? No, I don't want it to, but you still want to use Google Maps.
Okay. Well, this will be a good one, I think, because when I was preparing for this conference, and I was told I was going to host this panel, I'm not a GDPR expert at all, and Pavel said to me, he goes, "Why don't you use ChatGPT and just say, I'm hosting a panel." I literally did that. I typed in and said, "I'm hosting a panel of loyalty and CRM managers and directors, and I need questions about GDPR and its impact on their businesses." And they literally gave me 3 pages of questions, right? So here's the thing. When GDPR came, they said it's because all the data protection rules hadn't thought about social media. They hadn't thought about email. They were all old, antiquated. What in the heck are we going to do now about AI, chatbots, facial recognition, all of those things, right? What is personal? At what point, can a camera capture my face and use that for security versus marketing?
I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I have read the GDPR, and it's actually a very readable piece of legislation, and it was very, very well thought through. I think it backed off a little bit on what it could have done, but it's a beautiful piece of legislation from reading it, and actually it's now become the global norm. Most people are using that as the thing because it's a very well written piece of, and it's very understandable, and they did a lot of lobbying beforehand to understand with all the people where the tech was going. So I think, and it's a lot better than the Data Protection Act in the UK, which were there before. Okay. When I was working at Shell, I was arrested by the Data Protection Act.
Let me just tell you that guy. I got the
story in its own right.
I got the 5-minute warning about 2 or 3 minutes ago in the back. So we'll finish with this same question, but kind of roll. We'll go Richard, Pavel, and we can finish with Ian. But this was entitled "Where are we going to be in 5 years' time?" So based on the things, and who knows what's coming next after chatbots and everything. Richard, starting with you, where do you think we'll be in 5 years' time with GDPR regulations?
Well, I mean, I came back with my wife just the other day from the US, didn't need a boarding card, anything. Facial recognition, check me in. Facial recognition is coming. AI, as far as ChatGPT, I mean, there's a whole lot of trouble ahead. If those of you who've tried it, basically there was a a great quote the other day that I read. Essentially, this is the unauthorized appropriation of the creative work of millions of people that just happen to be lying around on the web. And essentially what is going to happen, I talked about the lawyers, they are coming for all those people. What ChatGPT does, it ingests huge volumes of data, but it can't validate it.
Yeah.
And you've got to be really, really careful if you use it.
Pavel?
You know, I don't know what's going to happen in 5 years, right? There are going to be evolutionary steps in the regulation where I firmly believe, and the notion of GDPR, of the customer being the owner of the data, I think that will continue to evolve, right? So imagine that you are at home in the evening, you come from work, you greet your kids, you open the fridge, you take a bottle of wine, you have a dinner, and these are your private behaviors, right? And you don't want anybody to know, typically, right? Yes, you might have a daughter and she takes a selfie, right? But in principle, these are your private behaviors, and this is where data privacy should sit, and only you should choose whether you allow that daughter to take that picture and share it with somebody. And that's the same with data.
Yeah.
I think that should be the principle, and whether you do that in an offline, you take a bottle of wine from your fridge, or whether you do it online, that should still apply.
Pavel, the reason, this is classic, what you just described there. Because there is no privacy, we need data protection. That's the distinction between the two. Our lives have been basically invaded.
There's just to finish before we go to questions here, on ChatGPT, if you Google this, but David Guetta, the DJ, he went to one AI bot and said, write lyrics that Eminem would write. Then he went to another voice one and said, sing these lyrics like you're Eminem. And then he sampled that into a song, right? But the big question is, it's not Eminem's lyrics, it's not his voice, but yet it is, right? So who owns that? It's going to be a very interesting thing. I'm sorry, I see you creeping up. Can we go to audience questions now?
Yeah, I think we're ready for a couple of questions. Danny?
I know, Richard, you know what question I'm going to ask is, GDPR started a storm of legislation, data protection legislation around the world. There's probably at least 50 countries around the world with different legislation. So loyalty programs, global consumer loyalty programs, we have key challenges on data residency. So what's your view on that? There's today technology allowing to deal with that, but what are your views on how that should be handled? Under what time frame? You know, in Japan, they changed the regulation of data privacy twice a year. How companies are going to deal with that?
Right, well, taking Japan, Japan is one of the countries that has adequacy with an adequacy agreement with the EU and therefore the UK. So one of the challenges around data residency, which is jurisdiction. Because one of the major debates talked about this battle between impunity and accountability is the transfer of data, which is happening particularly between Europe and the US, mainly because, of course, all the big tech firms are US. So we had Safe Harbor invalidated by the European Court of Justice. We had Privacy Shield invalidated. And at the moment, we've got an executive order which Joe Biden signed, and that is going to go the same way. So international transfers is one of the battlegrounds, because what do companies do? Everybody's left with scratching their heads and saying, right, what do we do? And all you can do at the moment is meet the obligations that you have. Data residency, Denny, is, as a concept, is I think, a great concept, but in practice, because of that transfer issue, it doesn't matter who it is that's even if you are using a cloud service in Europe from Microsoft or any of those, the US authorities still have reach to get your data. It doesn't matter. Under their Cloud Act, the US national security can reach into Europe to get that. So that's the battleground. And that's where the lawyers, to take your point, there's going to be a lot of scrummaging going on.
Good. We got time for one more question I hear. Raise your hand if you got something really, really burning. There we go.
It was clearly burning.
Yes, I think working CRM, I have daily struggle with our DPOs to discuss a lot of things. And lately, they've told us, so in order to do more, let's say, targeted segmentation using consumer data, they're asking us to implement this extra consent for profiling. So I want to understand maybe other brands, like how do you tackle that? Because you see that adding the extra consent box, you have the general consent for brand marketing, you have the profiling, probably some brands also implement some consent for exporting the audience to social platform, ad platform. So whenever you see that you're adding more boxes, consumer will be scared to really tick the box, but it's for the benefit of the consumer that if you tick that box, maybe you get more targeted, personalized marketing. How do we convince the consumer to tick that box?
There needs to, if I could go that way, we always use the word value exchange, right? You got to make it very clear why you're doing something. If you sign up for Amazon Prime, it's for free next day delivery, right? It's the problem is I've been on that side too. I've been working with a big bank years ago, and they were processing the same data that they've had for years. Then suddenly the lawyers came in and said, "Are we having lawyers in here?" Okay. The lawyers come in and say, "No, you can't do that anymore," although you've been doing it because we're scared of GDPR. So I think part of it is coming up with that value exchange. You're right. Part of that is in the program design of not being a bunch of scary tick boxes with a lot of legal words, but explaining people what you're doing with that data in very user-friendly language. Ian?
There's also layers of consent too. So it depends whether your data is anonymized, pseudonymized, or personal information. And so, for example, if everyone has a single PSP and they're tracking you can tokenize payment card data. So customers that are coming and using a payment card, you can track that card, and when that card comes back in, you can track that. But because you don't know the individual's name, but you know it's that card's being used, and this is the argument I've been having with lawyers recently, is that they never gave you their permission. But you can, as long as that data is either pseudonymized or anonymized, you can still use it to profile your customers, but you might not be able to use it to target that customers until you get their permission. But it's a really interesting angle about what you can do to single out that customer's behavior. So for example, the example we were using was someone comes into a store, we know they've used this card within the last half an hour, we know what the basket they've bought, we can profile all of that. We don't know the individual's name, but when it came down to the car that they drove in, we know that that registration came in, but we then chose not to put in the database the brand of car and the color of car, because as analytics we don't care, but actually having the brand of car and the color of car could really come to single out that customer without having permission. So there's really cool stuff you can do as long as you stay on the right line, pseudonymized and anonymized data. Does that make sense?
I think
so you might not need to ask permission all the time. You can still track data.
Yeah. I think the key is don't ask a lawyer if you can do something. Tell the lawyer, this is what I'm doing. Cover my back, right? That's the way to get away with it. Yeah. Thank you, guys. Thanks for the panel. Can we give them a round of applause? And thanks for your attention today. Thanks.